The Gohania accident. I was desperate. I thought I could pull something valuable out of the wreckage of that old abandoned hospital building. When Wagner and I dragged the metal canister out, it felt like we were holding some sort of prize. We hadn't imagined, not for a moment, what was hiding inside. I don't know what made us keep going once we started taking it apart, even as the sickness began to creep in. By the second day, Wagner was leaning against the wall, holding his stomach and retching. I could hardly feel my left arm anymore, swollen and red like it was blistering from within. But I kept working, convinced that the contents had to be worth it. That thing had been locked up tight. Then, finally, I pried it open. The capsule cracked with a small metallic snap, and I watched as a strange powder began to spill out. In the shadows of my cramped room, it shone bright blue. A hypnotic glow that was neither moonlight nor fire, but something between. It looked supernatural. I poked it with a screwdriver, my hands still shaking from the strange sickness that had settled into my bones, and managed to scoop a little pile of that powder into my hand. Wagner watched, pale and silent, as I tried to light it. The powder glistened like stardust. My mind was foggy from days of nausea, and it didn't occur to me that this was the stuff making us sick. We had no idea it could hurt us. How could something so beautiful be so deadly? When we sold the capsule to DeVere at the scrapyard, I thought we'd finally let it go. The powder was out of my life, but it was still in me. That sickness didn't leave. My hands started to fester, the skin peeling away in red raw strips. I don't remember the moment it happened, but eventually my left arm had to go. They took it off like it was dead wood, and I was left with an aching stump. But the worst was still coming. I started hearing people talking about DeVere, how he'd shown the powder to everyone, bragging about it like some kind of trophy. I heard how he'd drawn crosses with it, how he'd shared it like it was a gift, a miracle. And his daughter Leda had smeared it on her skin, enchanted by the glow. It breaks me, even now, knowing I was part of bringing that into her life. I can still hear her voice echoing in my mind. Laughter that was probably the last sound her mother heard before the horror started. Little Lade was just a kid, too young to know better. She wanted to show off her glowing skin, beaming with pride. But she had no idea she was holding poison close to her heart. They told me she'd smeared it on her arms, even her face. When they finally understood what the powder was, it was too late. People started dropping one by one. DeVere's wife, Gabriella, was the one to finally figure it out, and by then, the disease had already taken root in her too. The doctors couldn't even get near them without their Geiger counter's instruments screaming. They buried Lade in a coffin lined with lead and concrete. They say her skin was swollen, and her hair had fallen out in clumps. Her lungs and kidneys shredded by the sickness I had unwittingly given her. I wish I could say there was peace, but it wasn't like that. After Lade and Gabriella, more people fell sick. DeVere himself almost didn't make it, but somehow he survived. They burned everything, my house and DeVere's, scorched the ground, and swept away any trace of the powder's path through Gohania. They'll tell this story in reports, in scientific journals and safety regulations, but they don't know what it's like to see something so bright and beautiful turn into death before your eyes. The gas station. It was always quiet on my midnight shifts. One regular, a guy who stopped by every morning for his cigarettes, had this way of standing silently at the counter that always made me uneasy. He had a gruff face, always serious, always a little too focused, and he never smiled, no matter what I tried. But I made it my little mission to get him to smile at least once, just to see if he was capable of it. Every morning I'd have his pack ready on the counter before he even stepped inside, scanning it just as he walked in, hoping he'd be pleasantly surprised enough to crack even the smallest grin. Then, one morning, he finally did. He actually smiled. But instead of a simple thanks, he asked, "Do you ever get scared on the night shift? You small girl is not safe." I chuckled, saying it crossed my mind now and then. We could lock the doors if things got dicey, I told him. The provincial police were close by, swinging through now and then to check on us. I knew most of them by name. They'd wash their patrol cars out back, and even leave their radios on in the shop sometimes. It felt secure enough. He nodded, but his eyes were distant. He was somewhere else entirely. Then he started to tell me this story from when he first came to the country, back in the 80s. He worked night shifts, too, in a small station off a highway with his wife and kid waiting for him at home. One night, he dozed off in the back room. He didn't mean to, but he was exhausted, and the hours crawled, the silence lulling him to sleep. Hours later, he woke to someone shaking him, his manager frantic, shouting his name, calling for him to get up. When he opened his eyes, the manager was gripping his shoulders so hard his nails dug in, almost as if checking to see if he was even alive. His manager was pale, horrified, his eyes wide, and, as he helped him up, he simply whispered, "Look outside." The gas station's entire stock of motor oil was gone, every bottle swiped clean off the shelves. There were muddy footprints smeared all over the entrance, but the worst of it was the blood, handprints and smears across the walls. The manager told him he'd been calling for hours, hoping the noise would wake him up. But I had slept through all of it. The thieves had come and swiped all the oil and left him be because he slept through the entire thing, and then moved down the road to the next station for an encore. But at that station, it had gone differently. The clerk there had been awake. He had seen the group, watched them walk in under the pretense of buying something. He'd tried to confront them, demanding they leave, even called out as they started filling bags with the station's supplies. When he tried to fight back, stabbed him. He fought as hard as he could, but in the end, they left him to bleed out on the cold floor. His final breath spent struggling just to keep his eyes open. By the time help arrived, he was gone. I stood there, staring at my regular, his story pressing down on me. He looked right at me, his eyes as cold as the stories he just shared. "If you ever feel sleepy, just lock the door," he said, his voice low and serious. "It might save your life." I don't work at that station anymore, but I think about that guy all the time and wonder how his grandkids are. The good nurse. I still remember the way he moved through the dimly lit halls, quiet and unhurried. He was just another nurse, part of the faceless stream of night staff we all belonged to, slipping through rooms in the dark hours when patients' eyes grew heavy. To most of the patients, he was just Charles, the man who quietly, almost politely, administered their meds, checked their pulses, adjusted their IV drips. But to me, something about him always felt wrong. Nurses talk, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Rumors of people who went into cardiac arrest right after his shift ended, patients whose faces would twist in pain just after he passed through their rooms. It was all vague. Accidents, misfortunes, things too subtle to pin down. But the nurses who worked with him more often than I did, they kept their distance, refused to share rounds, brushed it off as though it was some personal grievance. But their eyes told a different story, one of deep, instinctual fear. One night, as I walked into the storage room to restock supplies, I saw him lingering by the shelves of IV bags, his back to me. There was an odd silence in the air, a tension that made the hair on my arms prickle. His hand moved swiftly, reaching for a needle. The faint click as he drew liquid from a vial I couldn't quite make out. I wanted to say something. "Hey, need some help?" But something stopped me. Instead, I watched him slide the syringe back into his pocket, his movements slow, deliberate. His face was a mask of calm as he turned around, like he hadn't just poisoned a bag that would end up in some unsuspecting patient's veins. He didn't even flinch when he saw me there. His eyes met mine, steady and cold, and he gave a slight nod as if we'd just passed in the hallway on an ordinary shift. From that night on, I couldn't look at him the same way. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A few patients had pointed him out, but then those patients always slipped away. They were the ones who coded, whose monitors would begin to beep in the frantic pitch of a flatline just hours after he'd tended to them. One night, a frail, elderly woman I'd been caring for reached out and grabbed my hand, her fingers ice cold, trembling as she begged me, Please don't let him come back in here." Her words cracked as she spoke, terror plain in her eyes, and I shushed her, promised she was safe. But just hours later, during Charles's round, she was gone. Her heart had stopped, her body pale and still as if the life had been stolen right from her. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to drag him into the light where everyone could see the truth, but it felt impossible. He'd worked at so many hospitals, slipping through the cracks each time. No matter how many people quietly suspected him, no one did anything. Management dismissed complaints, brushed off concerns such as paranoia or stress. After all, who would accuse someone of murder in the place meant for healing? It was a long time before he was finally caught, but by then, the damage was done. Hundreds of lives gone, their final breath stolen in the silence of the night. He confessed to some, not all, as if each life he took was just another tick mark in his mind. The hospitals covered their tracks, brushing off their complicity in the deaths that piled up under their watch. I sometimes wonder if he feels anything in that cold prison cell, if he's haunted by the faces of those he silenced in the night, or if, like a true predator, he only misses the thrill of the hunt. As for me, I can't step into a hospital without feeling that chill run through me. I still see his face in my nightmares, his shadow in the dimly lit hallways, and I wonder how many others like him are out there, silent, invisible, waiting in the dark for their next victim. Our dry erase menu board. It was a long day, and I was looking forward to crashing in bed after an evening of regular routine. My wife had taken our child out, I'd gotten dinner, played with the dog, done a few chores, and everything felt like the normal end to a quiet day. But right after I'd crawled under the covers, my phone buzzed with a text from my wife. I glanced down and saw a photo of our dry erase menu board on the fridge, the same one she'd filled out earlier in the week with our meals planned out in her usual neat handwriting. But the board in the picture looked nothing like what I'd remembered seeing that morning. The letters were scattered in random places. Some words were written backward or misspelled, as if someone had tried to copy her writing but hadn't quite figured it out. And then there were strange, looping squiggles drawn through some of the words, like marks you'd find scribbled on a child's paper. But our 1-year-old didn't have the reach or coordination to touch that board, and we hadn't had anyone else in the house all day. It didn't add up. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stared at the photo. The handwriting was unsettling. Not quite hers, not quite mine, and each letter looked slightly distorted, like someone had been trying to mimic our styles. My fingers shook as I messaged her back, asking if she'd messed with the board at any point. She replied almost instantly, "No. Why?" After a few tense minutes, we both decided that something felt very, very wrong. My wife called the county sheriff, who arrived not long after, his radio cutting through the unnerving silence that had settled over the house. He swept through each room, opening closets, checking windows, even crawling into the attic. But there was nothing. No sign of a break-in, no muddy footprints, no scuff marks on any walls or floors. He walked back out to us, his expression as uneasy as ours. "Not gonna lie," he said, glancing back toward the house. "I don't get spooked often, but this is strange. I'd recommend you change the locks, just to be safe. The former owners, they had any other family that might have keys?" We'd bought the house from an elderly couple who'd moved to live closer to their daughter. There wasn't much reason to think they'd still have access, but something about the sheriff's suggestion struck a chord in both of us. That night, we changed the locks. It felt silly in some ways, maybe even paranoid, but neither of us could shake the feeling of being watched. Going to the woods at night. That night still gives me chills, even years later. When I was 17, I was hanging out with two friends, and they wanted to go smoke weed in the woods. I didn't feel like it, so I drove them and waited in the car. But as I sat there alone, I decided I might as well head in and meet up with them. The forest was pitch black. There were no flashlights on phones back then, and the only light came from a faint slice of moon cutting through the trees. When I reached the trailhead, I saw 4 paths branching off into different directions. Not knowing which way they'd gone, I took the biggest one, assuming it was my best chance. After a few minutes, I reached a small dip in the trail and saw something on the other side. 2 shadowy figures by an old bench. One was sitting, the other standing just in front of him. It was eerie, but I assumed they were my friends, maybe taking a break and having a laugh at my expense. So, I called out to them, my voice sounding a little too loud in the quiet. Both figures turned toward me, and suddenly I knew something was off. They didn't speak, didn't move at first, just stared. And then without warning, the one who'd been sitting launched off the bench and came sprinting toward me. Not a sound, no footsteps, just this silent, dark shape bolting toward me. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then instinct kicked in, and I turned and ran, stumbling and tripping over roots, branches clawing at me as I tore through the trees. I could still feel him close behind, and every part of me was screaming to move faster, to get out of there. Somehow, I made it out, heart hammering as I locked myself in my car, panting and trying to wrap my head around what just happened. Every sound outside made me flinch, my eyes darting to the shadows just beyond the windshield. It felt like an eternity before I saw my friends emerging from a different path, laughing and carrying on like nothing had happened. I waved them over, hands shaking, desperate to know if they'd seen the guy. When they climbed in, I asked them if they'd heard me yell or seen someone else in the woods. They looked at me blankly, then told me they hadn't seen anyone. I still don't know what I saw that night. My heart still sinks, just thinking about that dude, sprinting in silence. The attack from my brother. A few years back, my brother was dating the love of his life. They'd met working at the same restaurant. He was the piano player, she a waitress, and things couldn't have been better between them. They shared the same rhythms, the same hours. Everyone could see how happy they were. But she had an ex. Jealous and relentless, he hadn't let go of her, or the idea of keeping her life under his control. He knew her shifts, knew when they both leave work, and somehow he twisted this knowledge into something dark and violent. Deciding he couldn't stand seeing her with someone else, he planned an attack, one that he meant for my brother. One night, my brother and his girlfriend were wrapping up after their shift, getting ready to leave. He stopped to chat with a colleague, just for a moment. That small delay meant she walked out the door first. She stepped outside, and within seconds, her ex was there, waiting. He slashed her throat, and then fled. She died in my brother's arms, right there, in front of him. The attack meant for him stole her life instead. In the years since, my brother's life spiraled through grief, anger, guilt, an endless storm. He's been through therapy, faced his worst days, and somehow he's starting to find his way back. But I can't shake the terror of it, of how close I came to losing my little brother, and how much he lost because of one person's twisted mind. If I ever saw that man, I don't know if I could keep my hands off him, but he's locked up now, and as far as we know, he'll stay there for a long time. The taxi. I was 10 years old, and it was supposed to be an ordinary school day. My mom had mentioned she might take me to the doctor in the afternoon for a recurring issue with my eyes. I figured that meant an early dismissal, so I was mentally preparing for it as lunchtime rolled around. The dining hall was buzzing, kids finishing up their meals and chatting in groups, when the office lady walked in, her gaze landing directly on me. She beckoned me over, her voice calm but urging. "There's a taxi outside waiting for you," she said. "It's time for your appointment." My mom didn't drive, so the mention of a taxi made sense. I nodded, packed up my things, grabbed my bag, and headed toward the door. But just as I reached the entrance, something clicked in my mind. My jacket was still in the classroom. It was cold outside, so I dashed back to grab it. When I finally made it back, the office lady met me with an apologetic shake of her head. "Too late," she said simply. "The taxi's already gone." A chill ran through me, a strange sense of guilt mixed with dread. I returned to class, my mind swirling with worry that my mom would be furious about missing the appointment she'd arranged. When school ended, I trudged to the front gates, head hung low. But there she was, waiting for me like usual, with no sign of a taxi in sight. Relief and fear tangled in my mind as I ran up to her, bursting into tears and stammering out an apology about missing the taxi she'd called. My mom's face paled, confusion overtaking her expression. She gently took my shoulders, her voice calm but firm. "What taxi?" she asked. I didn't call a taxi. I never even booked the doctor's appointment. My heart stilled. I tried to explain, my words tumbling over each other. But the realization sank deeper with each detail I recalled. The office lady. The calm certainty in her voice. The driver who'd apparently left when I was only seconds too late. No one ever figured out who ordered that taxi, or who the driver was. The school had no record of a car ever being called, and no staff could remember anyone arranging a ride for me. My mom never talked about it much after that, but I could tell it haunted her. Even now, I try not to think about it. The way a single, forgotten jacket might have saved my life. I watched my coworker get arrested. For over 3 years, I worked with this man, and for the last 2, we'd been side by side on projects, our desks uncomfortably close. One September morning, I arrived at work to an unsettling sight, about 10 detectives swarming the office. I froze, unnerved. I saw my coworker, disheveled, being led out in handcuffs. Though he always looked a bit off, this was different. I introduced myself to the detectives and asked what was going on. They couldn't share much, but gave me just enough. He was being arrested for something truly disturbing. For hours, I watched the investigation unfold. Detectives dismantled his workstation, combing through his belongings, snapping evidence photos, piecing together a puzzle that none of us knew had been forming. I was pulled aside to answer questions about him, his character, our interactions, anything unusual I'd noticed. I admitted that I'd always felt uneasy around him, a gut feeling I couldn't shake. I'd even told my husband that if something ever happened to me, this guy would be the first to suspect. It was meant as a dark joke, but suddenly it felt terrifyingly real. As the investigation continued, one of the detectives mentioned they'd searched his home and found more evidence than they'd anticipated. But what chilled me most was when they asked for my husband's and my full names. Something about this felt wrong, and when I later updated my husband, I could barely find the words. Near the end of the day, a lead detective, who couldn't even look me in the eye, asked me to make sure I stayed safe in case they couldn't book him. I didn't understand until he explained. My coworker had been keeping a journal about me for over a year, writing that he wanted me, but that my husband was an obstacle. The journal went on to detail a chilling plan to expose my husband in a false cheating scandal, intending to manipulate me into isolating myself from him. But it didn't stop there. His plan ended with my death at his own hands. The detective could barely hold back tears as he explained. He said it was the most depraved thing he'd ever seen, and that he didn't want to frighten me. But he had to be honest. The horror in his voice broke through any denial I'd tried to hold on to. This man who I'd worked alongside, who I'd exchanged small talk and project updates with, had fantasized about tearing apart my life and then ending it. Thankfully, they pressed charges, and he's now facing a long sentence.